Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to Responsive Web Design. This is lecture 13. All right, so today's lecture is going to be a little bit short. The only thing we're going to be covering is responsive web design patterns. All right, so we're going to be talking about the different layout patterns that are commonly used when we talk about responsive web design. Okay, so before we get started though, a couple announcements. The first one is that the sign-in sheet is being passed around. And the other one is just a reminder that there is no class next week at all, because next week is midterm break. So we have the entire week off. So don't come in, nobody will be here. So no class. Any questions before we get started with today's lecture? All right, so today we are going to be talking about responsive web design patterns, okay? And again, we're talking about layout patterns that are common to responsive web design. Will every website fit in these patterns? No, but these are common ones that are used and well established, okay? So before we get started, let me talk a little bit about where this information is coming from. So there's these two gentlemen, Ethan and Luke. Don't ask me to pronounce their last names because I have no idea how to pronounce them. But Ethan and Luke are two very important figures when it comes to responsive web design. Ethan, in 2010, wrote an article called Responsive Web Design, and it triggered the whole responsive web design movement. Okay, so prior to that, we really didn't get a handle on how we were going to handle these small devices and how we were going to build websites for them. Well, Ethan explained how we could go about doing it in a much better way than we've been doing it prior to that. So he kind of just opened everybody's eyes, okay, and that was in 2010. Well, in 2012, Luke saw, once we've gotten a handle of responsive web design, saw different patterns emerging in websites. And he broke those patterns down into 5 categories, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Okay? So the 5 categories are tiny tweaks, mostly fluid, column drop, layout shifter, and off canvas. So these are the 5 patterns he saw that websites were doing to make their sites responsive. And we're going to go through each one. I'll talk a little bit about what they are, and I'll show an example of how you build it. Okay, so the first pattern we're going to talk about is tiny tweaks. This is the simplest of all the patterns we're going to talk about. It's very, very simple. And it's simple because, one, it consists of a single column. Regardless of screen size, it's one column. And the other thing is that it relies heavily on HTML's natural responsiveness. Okay, so by nature, default out of the box, HTML is actually responsive. Our text responds naturally to us resizing our screen. For many years, though, developers and designers were fighting against that responsiveness and adding structure to make websites act more like print. Okay? Then we got multiple screen sizes, and then we had to go back to being completely responsive. Okay? So this relies on that natural responsiveness. You can use either CSS Grid or Flexbox to create a tiny tweaks layout. Okay, so let me jump out and let me show you what tiny tweaks layout looks like. All of these examples I'm providing you, they're on CodePen. There are links to them from the Responsive Web Design Patterns content module, which is out on the website as of this afternoon when I pushed it up. All right, so the first one we're going to look at is tiny tweaks. Now, it does not look very interesting because, again, it's a single column. Now, I didn't add a max width to this, but you most likely would add a max width. So let me put this in responsive mode, though. Here. Okay, so we can see that even though it's a single column, it just stays a single column and it responds. So I don't have any content in here, so it's really not that interesting to look at. But the point is that no matter what size of screen we're at, it's a single column. Now, I created this using CSS Grid so that I could lock the height of the top part, the header, and lock the height of the footer, and just leave this middle part to respond and fill up the rest. Okay, so I'm just using plain CSS grid for this. There is no media query for this one because it's not necessary. Again, that's what makes the tiny tweaks so simple. Generally, you're just making tiny tweaks in case something breaks. Generally, you won't have to do that. Okay, so very simple. The next pattern we want to talk about is mostly fluid. And the mostly fluid generally uses fluid grid systems. Now, when Luke wrote this, or when he came up with this concept and was talking about fluid grid systems, there wasn't anything. We didn't have Flexbox in 2012. We didn't have CSS Grid in 2012. What we had was the grid systems based off of the floating hack that we did back then for creating grids. So we floated all our elements over, and we created grids based off of that. So that's when they talk about fluid grids, that's what we're referring to. We don't have to do that anymore because now we have CSS Grid. All right, so we use a fluid grid system, and then we shift the grid at each breakpoint, or as necessary. So all our content is fluidly growing, and then we're like, okay, now we need to shift the content. So we shift it a little bit, and then we get a little bit smaller, and then we shift it again. Okay, very common. Generally, with this layout, our smallest screens are still a single column. We end up shifting the column down all the way to a single column. And larger screens will generally have a fixed width, or a max width, excuse me, not a fixed width, a max width. So we'll break it off. After like 1,200 pixels, we'll just stop making it grow. CSS Grid is really good for this one. Again, because of that fluid grid system at the very top, CSS Grid is a naturally fluid grid system, so that works really well for creating mostly fluid layouts. So again, let me jump over to my mostly fluid layout system here and put this into responsive mode. Should have done this before. Okay, so here we have, again, this is the largest screen. So we can see we have a header. It's this middle part that we're going to see change. Okay, so right there we have 2 boxes, and then we can see as we get smaller, it jumps down to a single box. So I am just using, not that interesting, granted. Again, these are simple examples. But I'm using CSS Grid here, and I have a single media query, because I only have one shift. But for each shift, you would just create that media query to adjust the grid as necessary. Now, this little break right here could be done without a media query at all if you've set up your elements correctly and using the auto fit or auto fill inside of CSS Grid along with the min max. You could potentially do this without any media queries at all. So that's mostly fluid. All right, so the mostly fluid was the most common one at the time. It probably still is today as well, where we're using a lot of these grids that just kind of fluidly flow as needed. The third pattern we're going to talk about is the column drop. And the idea behind this one is that you would structure your elements in a multi-column layout. Okay, so we have all our columns right out. And as the screen gets smaller, we will drop columns and stack them down below. Okay, so we'll start with like 3 columns. We get a little bit smaller. Now we have 2 columns at the top and 1 column at the bottom. And then we'll get down to just a single column. Okay, so we'll get smaller. So this is more of a desktop first or larger screen first as opposed to a mobile first design. You can design it mobile first, but the whole column drop makes you think of using a larger screen first. So when you use this one, the content is less fluid because we're going to have a fixed width at a point where the columns, okay, we're going to set this column is not going to get any smaller than that. And if it does, it's going to drop down below. So our content becomes less fluid with this layout. This is a great use for Flexbox and FlexWrap. Okay, so with Flex Wrap, it automatically jumps those boxes down for us when there's no more room. It does this automatically without media queries. Now, you may need to use minimum media queries to adjust things as necessary, but generally you can do this without media queries. Okay, and that's excellent. Again, that's our goal now, is to try and do with Flexbox and CSS Grid, we try to do it with as little media queries as possible. Okay, and again, I want to show you an example of this. So here is our column drop. Okay, and so here's our three columns. Okay, and then as we get a little bit smaller, we'll hit that breakpoint where this no longer fit, so it's going to jump down below, and so we have just 2 columns at the top, 1 column at the bottom. Notice this one's taking up more space. And right here is the final one where we have a single column. Now, I'm only using one media query for this, and the only reason why I'm using a media query, as you might notice, is that the elements switch their order. So this was the first element, this is the second element, this is the third element. Well, when we get down to the bottom, that second element becomes the first element in appearance. It jumps up to the top. So I have to add an order to switch that. That's the only reason why a media query is necessary. Okay. Other than that, I'm just using Flexbox with Flex Wrap. Okay, and it's handling. So we're kind of at a golden age here with Flexbox and CSS Grid. We can do these responsive web design patterns very, very easily with very little code. All right. Next one is the layout shifter. This is the most complex of the patterns that Luke pointed out. And that's because what it does is it basically, the layout shifts or changes for each breakpoint. So a mobile layout may be completely different than the large screen desktop layout. This is also one where you probably want to start off with, definitely want to start off with mobile, that single column view, because that's generally what we'll have for mobile. And then as we get more space, add more columns, add more complexity, and you can change it out. This layout also provides lots of room for innovation and creativity, because there's lots of ways of adding the layout to making them work. Okay? For this one, this is a great place to use grid areas, CSS Grid and grid areas, because with grid areas, we can visually set out that layout. We can set it up for a mobile. Okay, we got all our layout areas, and then for each shift, we just add a media query. And we just have to update that grid template layout areas, and our layout will automatically change for us. Makes it super simple. So media queries are only needed for each shift then. Okay, so let me take a look at that. This is my last example. All right, so here is our layout shifter. So you can see at the large, let's start with small here. So at the small, again, we just have a single column. And that column will grow. And then once we get large enough, you see that this top bar shifts to the side. Okay, assuming this is our navigation. And then the rest stays there on the right side. So, and again, we could have another shift. I only have one shift. But you could have additional shifts in there as well. And this is all done with grid, CSS Grid and template areas. Okay, super effective for this type of layout. All right, so the last layout pattern that Luke pointed out was the off-canvas layout. Okay, and what this does is it moves content off the screen instead of making it fit. Okay, so this is arguably not really a responsive web design pattern because it's not really adapting the content to fit the screen. It's just saying, I don't have enough room, I'm just going to shove it off. Okay. Now, this doesn't work for everything because, first off, if you're shoving content off the screen, why do you have that content at all? Okay. Is that content necessary? It's something that was definitely argued. Well, I remember back in 2009, 2010, when we were like, how do we handle this? Responsive web design still hadn't caught on yet. And we were like, well, we could take a bunch of stuff out. And I'm like, well, if we're taking all this stuff out, why is it there in the first place? Like, is that really necessary? So generally when we do this, though, off screen, is generally used for stuff like navigation or tools, which, yes, are useful, but we don't always need them there. Okay, so we can click a button and bring them back. So the other thing to note about with off canvas is that it does require JavaScript, because if you're going to push something off, we have to retrieve it somehow. We'll retrieve it using JavaScript. So we'll trigger JavaScript to bring it back and then remove it again. Okay, so that's your sliding navigation. We still see that today. Okay. With the rest of this, we can use just CSS Grid or Flexbox, because the rest of the layout generally is a single column, or it's going to be down to a single column on the smallest sides, and everything else is going to be off to the side. Unfortunately, I don't have an example to show you of this because I just didn't get it finished. But the key thing I want you to remember with off canvas is that it will require JavaScript. Now, we won't learn JavaScript in this course, but in next term, you will get some introduction to JavaScript. Fine. Okay. Now, with all of these patterns, now these are just 5 common ones that Luke pointed out, and that was back in 2012. A lot of them still hold true today, by the way, but we're not limited to just following a single layout pattern. Oftentimes, we'll mix them together to make our sites this way. Any questions about these patterns? Yes? Right, there's no horizontal scroll bar, so we're keeping it, it's just, we're using, they'll use transform or translate, I forgot to add it on the slide, use transform or translate to move the element off the screen. Okay, so it's not causing the horizontal scroll bar, we don't have that, although there are some sites that do that, by the way. They are purposely a horizontal scrolling site. Interesting little innovation or experiment with that. But that's not what it's talking about with the off canvas. We're literally sliding it off, so we have that content available, then we can reveal it later on. Yes? There certainly are. These are just the most common ones. So I focused on those because really, nowadays, those are the 2 you should be using. Okay, and I just pointed out that if you wanted to do this pattern, this is probably your best tool to use. Okay, but generally, for any website today, you should be using either Flexbox or CSS Grid or a combination of the 2. Okay, there's really no reason to use any of that old stuff that we did, because these are much better. Okay, and they're designed for layouts. Any questions? All right, so I do heartily encourage you to look over the content page for this and look at the examples and take a look at the code, how little code was used to create those. Now, those layouts were fairly simple, but you can see how on a large scale layout, it really doesn't take that much to create these. Okay? It doesn't really take that much now to create your responsive layouts. That's it. That's all I've got for today. Okay? I told you it was going to be a very short lecture. Honestly, this was supposed to be talked about on Tuesday. I just didn't have it ready. So, wrapping up time. Next week, again, no classes. Midterm break, so don't come in. No classes for anything for the whole week. When we come back, though, so that following Tuesday, when we come back, we will be covering Bootstrap, the Bootstrap framework. Okay, so this is a CSS framework. It allows you to basically design a site off of their pre-existing CSS. Okay, it can be very effective for creating prototypes. It can also be very effective for just building a site quickly. Okay, because they have a lot of styles already built in there. They have a lot of components. We will not be covering, we'll be spending 2 weeks with Bootstrap. That's not enough time to cover everything about Bootstrap, but hopefully it'll give you enough foundation that you'll be able to figure out the rest yourself. Okay, so that's what we'll be starting to learn when we get back. I do want to remind you about your midterm project. Okay, so that will be due the following Thursday when we get back from break. I think it's March 5th is the date for that. So that's when it's due. Okay, so hopefully by this point you've picked out which option you're going to be using. How many people have picked out an option? How many people have started? Okay, just a few of you. All right, so you do want to get started. Definitely get started over the next week because you will not have a lot of time after that. Right, so you have 3 options, right? You can use your mock-up from Design Foundations, you can create a new mock-up, or you can use the one that's provided. Okay, those are the 3 options. And again, it will be due, I believe it's March 5th, that's the Thursday we come back from break. Okay, so it's 2 weeks from now. Yes? There's really no limit. I mean, you should be able to do it with one, but if you want to break it up into multiple CSS files. Any other questions? All right, if there are no other questions, that is all I have for today. You can spend, we still have over an hour left of class, so hopefully you can use that time to work on your prototype or any other assignments, outstanding assignments you have. I'll be here to answer any questions. So any final questions before I let you go? Okay, so again, use the rest of the time to work, and I'll see you all in 2 weeks.